Thank you, Oksana, for inviting me here to give a talk on gods and goddesses with disability and those archetypal representations of disability, which are of my particular and personal interest. For a long time, I have been an activist for the Multiple Sclerosis Society of Serbia and providing psychological first aid to people with disability. And this talk that I'm going to give today is actually part of my thesis, part of my first year exam at the Jungian school. I'm going to read you now the legend of Ashtavakra, which is a Hindu legend, which is telling us a lot about how disability comes into one's life. And we're going to discuss a little bit about that. Hopefully you will offer me some visions of yours on how actually the legend of Ashtavakra informs us how are we going to deal with disability. So it goes like this. Little is known about the life of century in which Ashtavakra actually lived. His story is found in the major Indian epics Ramayana and Mahabharata. The legends state that sage Aruni ran a school teaching the Vedas. Kahoda was one of his students, along with Aruni's daughter Suyata. Aruni's daughter married Kahoda and she got pregnant. And during her pregnancy, the developing baby heard the chanting of the Vedas and learned the correct recitation. According to one version of the legend surrounding Ashtavakra, his father was once reciting the Vedas, but made mistakes. The fetus spoke to him from the womb and asked the father to correct the 8 mistakes that he made. The father got angry and cursed him to be born with 8 deformities, hence the name Ashtavakra. Ashtavakra means 8 deformities or 8 bends. Ashtavakra's father, Kahoda, went for riches to Janaka, the ancient king of Videha, for his family, as they were very poor. He was there defeated in debates of science by court sage Vandine, and in consequence he was drowned in water. Hearing of the drowning of her husband, Suyata, Ashtavakra's mother, kept it a secret from her child. When Ashtavakra grew up, he learned everything about his curse and his father drowning. Then he asked the mother to come with him to witness the great sacrifice of the very king Janaka that actually drowned his father. He was stopped at the gate from entering the king's palace because only Brahmins and kings were allowed to enter, and he was just a small boy. With the proficiency of art of speaking, he made the king amazed with the knowledge that he possessed, so was allowed to enter. There he challenged the very same Vandine that challenged his father, and after a heated debate, he defeated Vandine in a knowledge by words. He asked the king if Vandine will meet the same fate as his father and drown in water. After that, the Brahmins he drowned were freed, and his father was resurrected and very impressed about his son. And while going back home, he asked his son to take a dip in a nearby river Samanga. As Ashtavakra came out of the river, all of his deformities were cured. So at the beginning of the story, you could see the fetus learning to chant mantras, right? And it has a lot to do with 21st century, believe it or not, or with the 20th century, because the fetuses really can remember words that they actually hear while they are in the womb. That's important. After the 26th week of pregnancy, the fetuses hear and can even memorize the compositions of vowels, and in this case, those would be the mantras. That's the research done by De Casper and Spence. They analyzed the pregnant mothers, Latino mothers in the United States who watched television shows. And those television shows had the title music, and when they gave birth to those children, when they watched those television shows like soap operas, the children would immediately become peaceful, right? So it's like hearing the mother's voice when you actually watch a soap opera. So what was actually violated here, and why did he earn 8 deformities, is the fatherly principle. He dared to correct his father 8 times. Number 8 in Hindu mythology is very symbolic. That's very important because 8 incarnations of the goddess Lakshmi actually represent 8 riches or 8 supreme values so practically 8 deformities Ashtavakra needed to perceive or to see as some kind of advantage. So what is the advantage of being lame, blind, or deaf, or being disabled cognitively? That's a very important question with which person needs to stick to, right? The second of all, violating the fatherly principle is the principle of competition. It's the principle of achievement, of getting out of the box, going into one direction. And it's the principle of competitiveness. And in Oedipal sense, the boy wishes to dominate his father over the mother. So it's important to know that Ashtavakra did not know, or actually unconsciously made his father angry because he corrected those mistakes. So violating the fatherly principle in modern civilization, what does it mean? It means always pushing over the limit, like speeding in a car, or finding some competitive action which will actually lead to disability. But what is interesting here is that he had to redeem that fatherly principle for himself. He entered into the palace, and he used his knowledge to enter the palace of King Janaka and to challenge Vandine on this intellectual challenge. So Vandine was always drowning Brahmins, always drowning anyone who is intellectually inferior. And that has a lot to do with the shadow, because if you put everything underwater, so to speak, if you push everything into the unconscious that is inferior to you, every so often you're going to find that those elements are actually popping up. They pop up as some kind of spirits or complexes. And those Brahmins that were drowned are actually a sort of repression. And every so often we see in contemporary society people who are inferior and disabled are perceived as inferior, being put in a closet or stay in one room for eternity, not leaving their house, or being in some kind of seclusion or isolation. So what's important is that he in redeeming his father actually introduced him to the motherly principle, and that is the reverse samanga. The reverse samanga, the water, is a motherly principle, meaning the principle of care, of connectedness, of relatedness. And the person with disability needs to get in contact with the Great Mother, with the water, with how one does self-care, how one connects with oneself, and how one relates to oneself. The disability, by definition, is disconnection, and disconnection from social world, from bodily, from one's own body, and from one's own senses. So it's very important to practice that self-care system and to find it some way. However, what you can see in this myth is that he never actually rejected that masculine element of being an intellectual. So thinking through problems is very important. So engaging with the world is very important. And this myth tells us a lot about, this legend tells us a lot about activism. So if you want to conquer the freedom for the people, for the disabled, or if you want to make some difference, you have to first conquer the freedom for yourself. That's an important aspect. When you had first amputations, for example, the amputation of a leg or an arm is a disability in its own. The first attempts, at least in Christian world, were to simply substitute the limb, so to fill in the gap, so to speak. But was that enough? I wonder. Was that enough? Filling in the gap is actually could be understood as motherly and as fatherly. Fatherly is to invent the limb that is good enough to functionally operate right in the system of the amputee. And motherly principle is the principle that makes things whole, that makes things that goes towards wholeness and final integration. So both are needed. And Ashtavakra legend says, okay, we are intellectuals and we're doing the intellectual work, and we will think things through, but let's then integrate what we did. And the final integration came when he actually dipped himself into the river of Samanga. What we also see here is the early trauma, right? When disability becomes disability for a child, right? Ashtavakra was completely oblivious that he was deformed. And the second is that he did not know that his father was actually drowned in an intellectual battle. So the fatherly principle here is the punisher at the beginning and the victim of a punishment. So that's very important to hold both pieces of the puzzle together. So you will gain from competition. You will lose from competition. You will, if you try to be intellectual, you will have positives and negatives of both of these elements. But by the way, at the end of the story, when he was cured or when he was integrated enough, he actually went to the court of King Janaka, and Janaka and himself had long conversations over decades. And the fruit of that conversations is actually Ashtavakra Gita. That's important because the eternal dialectic with the father is relevant. That's one of the interpretations of this myth. What actually also tells us this myth about early trauma is that when disability comes early enough, the disabled child doesn't really believe that it's disabled. So you see that every so often in children with cerebral palsy that have sometimes very severe disability and very pervasive disability, but they are oblivious to it. And the disability then has to be personalized. It's not something that happens to everyone. It's something that happened to me, and it's okay because it can happen to someone else. That's the therapeutic approach that we have to do. That's one of the approaches. Yeah, the body actually becomes integrated into the self-concept. Marie-Louise Monfrance once said that people too much over-identify with the body. So you have, a broken nail, and the whole psychological system abruptly becomes disintegrated. So that's the problem, right? In Ashtavakra's case, the disability was not the centerpiece there, and it was something behind the scenes, really. The centerpiece was actually the relationship with the father and with the mother. And the disability was something to remind him of what's the price to pay if you don't have the relationship with the mothering energy and fathering energy inside. And that's important aspect here. And you see that that end of Ashtavakra myth actually that bad ending, right? That is like he becoming healed is really becoming integrated. Not really, the disability didn't disappear out of thin air, right? It's simply becoming integrated.